Hey, well, welcome everybody to Chinwag Nation, episode number 7, but part 2 of our overarching series of measuring the immeasurable. And today we're going to talk about stories and how impactful they are and what you can do about it. They're a big deal. But before we get into that, I just want to kind of talk about some basic housekeeping. These are our opinions. They don't reflect past, current, future organizations. This is just us having a good chin wag, talking about leadership, talking about our experience, and just really wanted to share this out with our community and build community around the space. And when I think about stories, I the first thing that comes to mind, and we talk about this often throughout all of our lives, Stephen, and that's culture. I mean, the connection to culture. And within stories and within culture, I think there's a shared accountability, right? There's a choice to on where you want your culture to go, and there's a choice on what stories you want to tell.
Yeah.
And I learned this a long time ago in a leadership piece when I was leading teams, and someone said to me, I can't remember who it was. They said, "What you talk about, you breathe life into." Right. So if I want my culture to be healthy and thriving and engaging, and I want people to show up excited for work, what stories am I telling on a regular basis that create that kind of an environment, right? Because that's what I'm breathing life into. That's what I'm putting energy into. And that's really kind of a large part of what we're going to talk about today. And so I don't know about you, Stephen, but like that's when I think about this subject, that's what resonates with me.
Yeah, it reminds me actually, Brian, I had a post-it note. It's still there on my computer from at one point you had said, and I don't know if this is a Brian
You wrote
Markovic.
a post-it note that I
I did. I know.
wow. Thank
You
you.
say you say a lot of words, but every once in a while I'll actually listen. But you said
I don't know
words.
who's watching, but if people know me, yeah, I'm definitely. If you ask me a yes/no question, I'm definitely going to probably tell you a story. But
That's fair. Yeah. You're the extrovert out of the two of us, that's for
yeah,
sure.
probably.
But you said words make worlds.
Mm,
And that always resonated with me. And it can translate to a lot of other quotes as well, like perception is reality.
sure,
Um, and something can be absolutely true, even though it may not be real. And
sure.
so when we're talking about the power of words here, we're talking about stories. It's amazing just the psychological impact
Yeah.
that perception can have and words can have.
I mean, there's a cycle in the space too, right? So when we kick this off, I talked about the shared responsibility. There's a responsibility at the leadership level. There's a responsibility at the staff level, right? There's a responsibility for everybody that's part of the organization to either tell a story or perpetuate a story, right? Or not to. And I look at stories like, so if we're talking about measuring the immeasurable, right? I look at stories as something that are they're not always, measurable. Sometimes they're squishy and they're really a data point, right? Stories are a data point. And I think there's this cycle, right? Where as a leader, you want to know what stories are happening. But if you don't build the trust to get that data, right, then you might be getting incorrect data, right? So if you go to an employee and you say, hey, how do you think everything's going? How are you feeling about things? They say everything's great. That might be an indicator,
Yeah.
right? If you know things aren't great, right? Something your writing reflects, something in your gut's telling you, I don't know if things are great. I'm going to check in with my people and there and everybody around you is saying everything's great. That might be an indication that you might have to do some work. But I do believe there's a connection between relationship building and trust and and getting good data as it relates to what stories are in place. And what I mean by that is if you're a new employee and you're coming into the organization, and this is something that's covered in the cultural web model, right? What are the stories that people first hear
Yeah.
when they walk into an organization? Oh, watch out for this person. Hey, watch out for this team, right? And those are the stories that perpetuate and frankly are consistently those things that will work against an organization and work against a group on moving their culture or shift culture, right?
Yeah. And I find it interesting, Brian, because just for context, if we're going to talk about negative and positive stories, right?
Sure.
You yourself even said, like, these are stories that are going to work against your culture, not
Yeah.
for your culture,
Yeah.
against your culture. And so I think that in and of itself speaks to the experience, and I can relate to that experience, right? That a lot of the stories that get told oftentimes aren't the positive ones that you want to have circulating around. And the chances are, for the purposes of this chinwag, we're probably going to be talking more about the ones you want to be aware of, and how do you change that narrative versus, I don't know, the ones that you actually want to tell.
Well, I mean, and there's two ways to, I think, do organizational development when it comes to these types of things, right? There's the gap analysis, right? There's where are we at now? Where do we want to go? What's the gap? And I think that kind of connects to the negative, right? The negative stories, right? Are there negative stories that are working and that are in place that conflict with where you want to go, right? And the stories that you want to tell. And then there's the appreciative inquiry approach, which are what are the great stories that you want to keep telling, that you want to perpetuate, right? Hey, go connect with this person, go work with this person. They're amazing. Well, that might be something that you want to glom onto. What are they doing over in that area that perpetuates this amazing story that you want to build upon and that you want to manifest, right, in a larger part of your organization? So I think there's definitely two ways to look at that. And Brittany says, culture stories tended to resonate with me. Firm talk, firm speak, firm look. Definitely telling. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about sometimes the cultural work that I've done in the past. And if you're taking like a very broken culture and you've got a long way to build that culture into a more mature space, sometimes even your best attempts at building culture and building trust can maybe be overexerted, if you will. And you ever get that, like, here's another trust exercise, and meanwhile, like, you're out there trying to cheerlead for this cultural change and everybody else is listening to you because you're in a position of power, but at the same time everybody agrees, like, this is BS, we don't want to adopt that.
That's a story. Well, that's the trust and relationship piece. Like,
Yep.
hopefully you have somebody in your space who's gonna pick up the phone and be like,
Yep.
hey, nobody believed you.
For sure.
They gave you a high five because oops, I clicked on something here. They gave you a high five because you're their boss. But they really don't like what you had to say. And I think that's, like, if you're doing the work, the daily work, right, to create space to have those conversations, hopefully somebody will let you know about that. Hey, there's Alyssa Elliott says, amplify the good. There's my beautiful wife, Johanna Mark. I think she's like our most consistent attendee.
She's the OG.
Like, we should get a prize for that. And hey, Ryan, good to see you. Thanks for joining as well.
Brian, aren't you the prize?
What's that?
Aren't you the prize?
Well, that's another episode, Stephen. Yes, I hope my wife would say that. Alyssa said, story of my life, Stephen, in terms of just people. I'm assuming, Alyssa, you meant Stephen's aspect of, like, over amplifying because you're in a position of power. I think that's definitely a thing. I remember when I was going back to school, and that they had this, like, breakout. They had us read a section of a book on organizational development, and they said there's two ways to truly shift your organization. There's the short game, right, which is a CEO or a big leader. They come in and they assess the culture and they just go, and they clean the slate and they bring in the people that are going to tell the stories that need to be told, so that way they can kind of get a good baseline. And then the second one, which Alyssa spoke to there in the chat, is identify a group or a team in the organization that is kind of close to what you want to do, and then promote out from there. Actually, like make that group, that bubble, your succession plan, and that's always stuck with me, right? Like when I see a case study or read a story of a leader coming in and just kind of going, whoosh, I'm like, oh, they didn't like what was in place, and they needed to shake it up.
Yeah.
And so I think I don't know if that's what's happening in the AI space, with kind of the layoffs and different things like that. Like maybe there's just they want to reset the resistance, but I think that's a pretty common thing in the organizational development space. But
Yeah,
I think
I mean, the AI layoffs, that's a whole different topic, but I'll just throw it out there. I think it's the first time in a long time that we've seen organizations lay off to streamline versus resistance.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm going to say about it for right now.
Yeah, that's a totally different subject.
Yeah.
But I was like, I'm like, hey, what do I want to bring into this conversation in terms of stats and studies? And I remember, yeah, absolutely, Brittany, find your tribe and scale, 100%. But I remember there was a book I read a while ago. It was called All Marketers Are Storytellers, but they had this portion of the title crossed off that says are liars. And it's a book by Seth Godin. It's small. It's a quick read. I don't know if anybody's read that book, but I highly recommend it because it talks about this idea of worldviews, right, and belief systems. And there's lots of different models like that, like the ladder of inference and different things that help explain how worldviews get built or kind of come into place. But one of the things that stuck with me is once a worldview is set, right? Once somebody firmly believes something, it is really hard to move them off their spot. Like insanely difficult. And I think that's I think that's why you see some of these cultural efforts and cultural initiatives struggle to get off the ground or even sustain or even get going, because those stories, those belief systems are so entrenched that like it takes some significant effort, some significant focus to really understand and really nail down and document, like, what are those worldviews, what are those stories, and do we even want them to be those things, or how do we want to change them? And like I mentioned earlier, I think I know it's a shared decision, right? It's a shared choice between the leaders and the people in the organization. They all have to, I think, acknowledge and be aware of, like, these are the worldviews that make up who we are.
Yeah, and I know you and I have talked offline about like what arc are we going to do after we talk about the cultural web model, and we were talking about change management today, and there's some aspects of change management that are very real but can be a hard pill to swallow if you're a people pleaser. One of which is like you're not going to be able to make everybody happy, and there is a strategy in finding your early adopters and finding those who will adopt after, right? But not letting perfection get in the way of better and things along those lines. And that could be really difficult. But for some reason, something that keeps popping up into my head today, Brian, on this conversation about stories is, position matters. So I will tell you, like, I won't personally hear a lot of stories in a higher up leadership space because there's
not connected.
Well, the saying "it's lonely at the top" was created for a reason. Despite your best efforts, right? You're always in a position of authority, and people can be hesitant to talk to you, no matter how much trust you build. But if you have an administrative assistant, you will hear all the stories, which is incredibly helpful. To just kind of get a pulse on the culture. And one of the things that I learned from the data I would receive from administrative assistants that I've had is that the stories about me and what I'm doing and what's within my control it's less about what I'm saying and more about me listening and doing. Right? And I just
is that like what? Is that like what gets modeled gets done? Kind of a
Yeah, yeah.
okay. Yeah.
I'm just thinking like, I think we talked in a previous episode that one of the first things I like to do with a new team is right off the bat just kind of block off time and learn about their experiences, learn about their work, learn about who they are as people, so I can truly understand, this business model as it pertains to all the resources that I have. What empowers these individuals? What's been challenging for them? How can
Mhm.
I empower them and advocate for them? And I just remember an immense amount of feedback coming through my administrative assistant on, well, Stephen took 30, 45 minutes, 60 minutes just to listen.
Mm.
And then when he was developing a strategy, like he actually reflected back some of the things that I had told him, and I feel heard, right? And it was less about the stuff that I was saying and just more about taking the time for this. We talked about mattering in a previous episode,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Allowing people to matter. And I think that sort of relationship building, that sort of foundational variable is essential when it comes to the narrative that's, getting put around.
No, I can see that 100%. Especially when it comes to shared accountability. I'm sure those are the stories that you want to be told if you're a leader, right? Hey, Steven, listen. Say Steven's willing to give you an ear, and you know what? He's going to let you know if he does something about it, and if he doesn't do something about it, he's going to explain the why.
Yeah.
And I think that's super powerful, and I think that speaks to the importance of this worldview concept, and that's just being disciplined. And I know that word itself has some negative connotations, especially when it comes to people work. But uh, what, how you show up, how you operate, what you model on a day to day will, in effect, and could perpetuate, right, the improvement of stories that are being told.
Yeah.
And I think when we get into the down the line, when we get into the subject of morale, we kind of can talk about how what happens when somebody like you shows up, but then you might have a peer who doesn't show up the same way, and how that conflict can impact morale. But that's for a different subject. But I want to get into what Brittany put down here for just a quick second, because this live is really about it's about us talking about our experience and recommendations to you, but it's also about engaging with you. So love the question. Brittany says, I wonder why as a society we're so adaptable to trends. We're happy to switch to the latest fashion, the newest tech, etc., but less adaptable to culture changes in the workplace. It's so weird. And my mind, when I read that, my mind immediately went to Psych 101 when I went my undergrad, and they talked about like mask theory, right? And I think from a society standpoint, we're quick to kind of, I think, forage and group because we assume the identity of the trend versus our own individual identity. And maybe in the workplace, it maybe is a little bit more about individual identity, and your identity is about the work. And so there might be something there, but I'm not a social psychology major. That's not my expertise, but that's where my mind went, is just like, I think it's the group identity versus the individual identity things. But Stephen, what are your thoughts?
I was actually going back to a course in anthropology that I took, and
Okay.
I was
We're
not.
going back. We're
I
going
will
back.
go way back. I was not a huge fan of my anthropology class. I couldn't remember a single dinosaur bone or monkey bone that I had to memorize. But one thing I do remember that really stuck out to me was
Wait a second. What?
in anthropology. Oh, we had to
I know
like
monkey.
memorize all of these different bones of
Okay.
all these different animals from
Just to
all these
show
different.
evolution or something? Is
Yeah,
that
exactly.
okay? Okay.
But there was one thing that really stuck out to me, because I love the outdoors, and people talk about all the time what you need to survive outdoors, right? There's water, there's
Mhm.
food, and there's shelter,
Yeah.
and fire. That helps too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
from an anthropological perspective, there was shelter, food, water, but then going back in time, there was this biological need to be in a community to survive. You
Hmm.
are much more likely to survive if
That's
you
got to
were.
be today too.
What?
That's got to be today too.
I mean, I guess you have to define surviving,
Okay, that's true.
but
Yeah.
that's yeah, I think there's this biological, sort of code within us that understands the importance of community from even just
So,
a survival perspective.
so what you're saying is we tend to move faster in the public space outside of work because we want to be connected to that.
Maybe, you know, it's it's a weird time, and I'm not the best person to talk about or talk to when it comes about maintaining certain social expectations because I'm pretty set in my ways and I'm okay with that, and I keep my social circle fairly small. Um, but I mean, I can tell you, I've got a teenage daughter who tells me like how far behind the times I am frequently, and calls me a boomer, even though that's not the generation that I may necessarily actually belong to.
Yeah,
Um,
I can relate
but
to that.
if you look at the amount of money that's out there in creating trends, heck, there's even cryptocurrency now that's about memes, I believe, right? Like people
Sure.
are creating currency on this aspect of trends and branding value and different things like that. It's,
Well,
it's insane.
I think there's a connection to the workplace too.
Oh, absolutely.
I think stories connect to that brand, right? And what brand do you want to put out there, right? As it
Yeah.
relates to running your org. Ultimately, right? We're talking this story arc is about measuring the immeasurable. And Alyssa had a great point in chat. She said, senior leaders tend to heavily discount the relationship building efforts Stephen just spoke of, but they are so critical because they pave the way for speed, which is ironically what the leaders expect and want, right? So you have to, in order to measure, right, or account for the data point that is the story, you have to put the time into it. You have to connect to it, and you have to model and show up in a way that that information makes it to you, right? Because not everybody's going to have an executive or administrative assistant, right? Feeding them the info, right? But you have to put the time in, and I think that's maybe part of the relationship building block or gap, right? Is it's a time thing, and from what I've seen, and this is just for being empathetic to people who are in leadership positions in general. It is title sometimes denotes competency, right? And I'm not saying this in judgment at all, but a lot of the times people will get into a leadership position, but they've never been shown how to do that relationship building piece or how to connect and build trust with their people. They've only been shown one way, and so I think there's a nature versus nurture aspect, right, to leadership and how people show up. Um, does the environment support that, right? The culture, and is everybody moving in the same direction? And then there's the aspect of like have they been shown before as well? I think all of those things matter, especially as it relates to stories and what stories are told and what stories are told about leaders in general. Uh, as I was digging into the subject, Stephen, you went away, so I don't see you anymore, man. But that's okay. We'll keep rolling. I don't even know if you're on here anymore. Stephen, are you there? Okay, I'm gonna keep rolling until Stephen comes back. Um, but I was reading, and I'm sure everybody can relate to this. Everybody can connect to this in some way, shape, or form. That uh, bad news spreads faster than positive news, and I don't have a reference. I don't have a source. I don't have anything that tells me right. Uh, that I can give you a reference to, but that 90% of news stories are 90% of the news stories are out there are negative. And I had to ask myself why. Why are 90% of the news stories negative? And that's because people will spread them faster, right? People will spread that news faster. And I know we're not talking news, right? We're talking about the workplace. We're talking about um, really kind of stories within the workplace, but 90% of negative stories, or 90% of the stories in the news are negative. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating. And I I remember when I was studying in the organizational development space, and learning about brain science, right? There was this little blurb that said, people get a dopamine release for good news, and they also get a dopamine release for bad news. And so negative news is rewarded. And I think that's the same way for stories. And that's why they're so hard. That's why they stick, right? Stick around. Welcome back, Stephen. I lost you.
Sorry.
Lost you there. It's okay. I'm just talking about how the spread of bad news and why that's so critical, right? To pay attention to it. The other thing was, so 90% of news stories are negative, and the other thing I wrote down is that bad news spreads 70% faster than good news.
I feel like
And
there's a correlation between those two things.
I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, if news spreads faster when it's negative, and your business is the news,
Yeah.
what are you going to put out there?
Yep.
Primarily.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the hardest things to navigate, right? You'll set on an effort to improve things, and you'll have a great plan of action to move things forward, and you'll have these set of stories that continually undercut, right, and work against you and are a blocker. And that's what we put in the post leading up to this event. Brittany asks, how do you guys measure leadership across functions where you're not the on paper leader for that function? I'm gonna need to chew on that, Stephen. You go
Yeah.
first.
I mean, it's a difficult question because a lot of the times within an organization, I really try to figure out, what is actually within my control, versus what's not within my control, and knowing the difference, right? And focusing on the things that I can actually influence and potentially change. And we've talked a little bit about this when it comes to cultural development, and how, depending on the level of sponsorship that you have across an organization, by the most senior leadership, the lack of ability there would be to, or I should say, either the lack or the empowerment of the ability to be able to spread that culture across an organization versus operating in a silo. And there have been times where I've worked for an organization where I will focus on the people, focus on the culture, which is what I'm passionate about, to drive results. And the story that's out there is that, that organization, or my organization, I should say, operates in a silo and a bubble. And that's like the only sphere of influence that I have. Now, to be fair, like, if this is a cross organization type effort, and say like my direct reports are participating, and I'm receiving feedback, or I'm receiving data about, whether the you could say like the discussions are healthy, or the results are either coming across as expected, or we may be shy of meeting the expectations, right? Like, then there's opportunities to have conversation, with positional power, that may exist from where you're at. Now, we'll say, we've been talking about the importance of relationship building within a team, but it is really important to relationship build across an organization. And I can't encourage you enough to have those relationship building opportunities outside of the office as well. Like, go have a coffee, go have a lunch with these people within your network, and really try to get to know them as people. Because the more trust you have across the organization, and I know that this is probably pretty simple and elementary, but I want to throw it out there. But the more trust you have in a relationship, the more honest of a conversation you can have, because your intentions don't need to be clarified, right? If somebody knows you and respects you, trusts you, and you're coming to them with feedback, or with a plan of some sort of change that maybe goes beyond the reach of just your particular division and maybe impacts theirs as well, like, they're going to listen in a different way, and they're going to respond in a different way, because you have a more trusting relationship with them.
Yeah, I love that, Stephen. My mind went to coalition building,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to. And coalitions matter, especially if you're really trying to drive your work forward cross functionally and ensure that what you're doing matters. My mind went actually a little bit more tactical, and I'm like, how can I tie this to what we're talking about
Yeah.
today, right? In stories, and my mind immediately went to your strategic plan, right? So if there were a book, like if your organization had a book, aka your strategic plan, you would have many stories across different functions that make up that strategic plan. And in an ideal world, like this is purely theoretical based off of my master's degree studies as it relates to human resource management and looking at the organization as a whole, your strategic plan is really the story that should be told most consistently, right? As it relates to just moving the organization forward in a collective way. And that if I'm going to measure cross functionally across leadership functions when I'm not the leader on paper, but I have an onus to like move this plan forward with my peers, a strategic plan like is the first thing that comes to mind. And like I'm like, oh yeah, those are the stories we want to tell. What are we measuring? What's most important? How does that data impact me? How does my work line up to this greater plan? And can I see myself in it, to your point around including your people, right, in developing things, Stephen? And then the other tool, which even goes a layer down, is a fundamentals map. And we were talking about other story arc, and that kind of plays into our lean and continuous improvement space. But a strategic plan, that's why that type of work is so important. It should, I mean, if your strategic plan and your values matter, then they should be talked about all the time. And as a leader, we should be finding opportunities to find ways to talk about those things in every team meeting, in every initiative, right? I mean, that's maybe not what you were looking for, Brittany, but my mind like meant to like went a little bit more tactical. And that's right. Yeah, that's your North Star. Like, what are you all driving towards? And then how can you collectively do that? And I think it's vital. I think it's fundamental, and I think it's like the book, right, for your organization that stories are told from. And that's where my mind went. That's where my mind went a little bit.
Now I'm thinking about it, and I just want to throw it out there that it's super important to be respectful of what people are accountable for, not just responsible for, but accountable for. Because when you start to reach beyond what you may be accountable for, maybe it's something that you're responsible for, and you start taking over what may be somebody's perceived scope of work, that potentially could be part of their own organizational identity.
And you don't have the relationship.
And you don't have the relationship.
Yeah.
Like that can muddy the waters pretty quick. So be thinking of those types of things, right? As we talk about stories, like what is somebody else going to say about your actions from their potential seat? How did you approach it? What were the outcomes? What are their peers saying about it or going to say about it? And use that to strategize how you ultimately converse with these individuals and develop a plan.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that's I when I was I don't know, 8 years ago or so, I was maybe actually longer than that now. 10 years ago, when I was first starting my state government service, I led an organization-wide effort to shift to a customer experience focused culture for an organization. Right, over 1,000 people, different layers, different levels, impacting policy. It was a big body of work, and I was meeting with the executive sponsor, and this culture, right, that had been in place was like a compliance culture. It had been in place for a long time, like for like decades, and we needed to shift to a customer focused mindset. And I was meeting with the executive sponsor, and he said, Brian, he's like, I've been hearing, from the people from a lot of people that they don't want to move into this new space of doing work, like where it's more about soft skills and less about making sure that we're checking every box and being rigid, right, inflexible. He's like, do you think that's a majority of the folks? I said, no, I don't think that's a majority. I think the majority actually want to move to a space where they are focused on the customer, where they want to deliver great work. Right? I believe that's the story that's being told more often than the negative stories. I said, however, however, the folks that want to keep things the way they are, they have a bigger platform. And what we need to do is we need to build a platform for the folks that want to tell the story of the future. Right. So it's about understanding the stories and understanding what's in place and getting that good data. But then it's also saying, like, do we have the right platforms and the right pathways in place for those stories to even be told? So it's just as important to understand, but it's also important to design ways to get that story out as it is to understand what stories are there. And I think that's vital, right? And that's a function of measurement, right? That's what do we have in place that de-amplifies or amplifies the stories that we want to be told, and what do we need to create and deconstruct potentially, right, to ensure that those stories are told. And so you need both, right? I think you need both. And the more that we leaned into that future right way of doing things, the more stories that we could see and make more visible. And to this date, that body of work is still in place, right? And I think that's a testament to knowing that the new way of doing work is what was wanted versus the old way.
I always love these little Chinwags because, like, we have a couple of bullet points that we try to cover, but most of it's just a dialogue between buddies. And so as we talk, certain things come to mind, and I think about, we talk a lot about theory, and we talk about different tactical things you can do as it relates to a particular topic, right, within an organization. But it truly kind of boils down to the scientific method, because no organization is ever the same. And so you're going to have this hypothesis.
You have to break down the scientific method.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
Okay, all right.
You have this hypothesis. If I do X, then the result's going to be Y. And so you do X, and either the result is going to be Y or it's not going to be Y, right?
And then what are you going to do about it?
And then what are you going to do about it? And I think so many stories come from the results of, the attempt to change. And, this person tried and they didn't change it, just like the 4 leaders before them, right? Sure. And we hear terms as well, like fail fast, don't be afraid to fail, don't be afraid to be innovative. But then you see a lot of organizations that may penalize you for failing, or there may be repercussions for not necessarily having the results that you had.
And that's one of the first stories that gets told when a new employee starts.
Yeah. And so I think it's important to consider that too, the results of your efforts, the stories that are going to be told, how it relates to your culture and your ability to actually be able to do those things. It's really, really important.
Yeah, I love that. I see so many threads to our next story arc around change management. And just how just a quick snippet before we close out here and open up for some questions if folks have them. And that's if you're reestablishing a new body of work and it has a connection to a previous body of work, right? That story arc, that story connection is something to consider and something to plan. I always add, there's a lot of change models out there, which we will get into in our next series, but I always add a understand the history section to my change management approach, because I don't want a new change effort to be seen as a repackaged, relabeled thing.
Yeah.
Right. And when it's really not. And so I think that's a really important piece as well with respect to stories and change and how they're connected. But we have about 5 minutes left. We like to leave the last 5 minutes for any questions you have, any thoughts, anything you want us to dig into before we close it out. And Stephen, while we're waiting for folks, anything you want to share and close out before we wrap up?
maybe just we've talked about personal power and positional power, and now we're talking about the power of stories, right? And I think leadership oftentimes requires some pretty thick skin, in the sense that regardless of your best attempts, there's always going to be stories out there about you, about your efforts, about things that you're pouring your heart and soul and energy into, that can be pretty negative. And just really taking the time to give yourself grace and kindness, and understanding where your intent is on what it is that you're trying to do. So that way, those negative stories don't deter you from what may potentially be the majority of how everybody else is feeling about it. Because to your point, Brian, um, negative news has a much larger and faster platform.
Mhm.
So you may hear the negative, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's how the majority is feeling as well. So just take the time to not be reactive, right? And think it through.
Yeah, that's a great heartfelt way to end our time, and really kind of a really human way to look at this. Yeah, I think there's a there's almost a need to be indifferent, right, when you hear some of the stories, so that way you really look at them just clearly as a data point and not necessarily something to be internalized. But I think that's a great call out. Sometimes sometimes things are just heavy. And I think you called it out earlier, right? If you have the relationships in place, then I think, and you invest in those things, it can give you an outlet to talk through some of those stories, because chances are you're not alone.
Yep.
And if you're hearing a negative story about something you're doing or hearing, somebody else has experienced it before, and I think it's important to reach out and lean on folks, when those things are happening, so you can process through it. Alyssa said, "I just want to come have coffee with you dudes. I feel an urge to carry on some of these threads or grow a coalition. Let's do it. That's what this is about.
Yeah.
Uh, it's
Build
about
that third place.
it's about community. We talked about this in our very first episode, Why Third Place. This is not about money. This is just about us wanting to build a leadership community. Um, I had fun with this branding. I had a lot of fun. I have a friend who makes t-shirts and hats, and I just had fun. Steven has a sweater. I think his wife has a sweater. My wife and kids have sweaters. Um, we're just having fun, and we're passionate about this idea of building community. Third Place was actually coined. I have to go look at my notes now. It was coined by a guy, and it's a place outside of work in your home. Just build community with folks, and that's what we're trying to do. So Brittany says, "Thanks, guys. Lots of gems today. Appreciate you. Appreciate you too, Brittany. Thanks for the comments in the chats, and for folks that joined us." Alyssa, "Sounds great. Me and Steven will have to hook up and have coffee and catch up with you. Um, and look forward to it." Well, we wish you guys all a great day. Thanks for joining us, and
Everybody.
reach out anytime.